Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to get into the webinar, and then we'll get started very shortly.
Where in California are you?
Granite Bay, California.
I don't know where that is.
Most people don't.
Okay. Not saying. I think that's smart.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to Politics and Prose Live. We are here tonight with AJ Baime and Larry Tye. And before we kick things off, I'd just like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. The first is we really encourage everyone to contribute a question in the question and answer portion, which will be in the last 20 minutes of the event will be dedicated to your questions. And to ask a question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And so if you click on that, you can type in your question and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. The second thing I'd like to draw your attention to is in just a minute, I'm going to post a link to each book in the chat. And we encourage everyone to buy the books tonight. And it's a great way to support our authors and to also support Politics and Prose. And now without that out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce AJ Baime and Larry Tye. AJ Baime is the New York Times bestselling author of The Arsenal of Democracy, FDR Detroit in an Epic Quest to Arm America at War, and Go Like Hell, Ford, Ferrari in their battle for speed and glory at Le Mans, and The Accidental President, Harry S. Truman and the 4 months to change the world. Baime is a longtime contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and his articles have also appeared in the New York Times, Popular Science, and Men's Journal. Tonight, he'll be discussing his latest book, Dewey Defeats Truman, which sheds light on one of the most momentous 6 months in American history. We're also very honored tonight to be joined by Larry Tye, who is the best-selling author of Bobby Kennedy and Satchel, as well as Superman, the father of Spin, Homelands, Rising from the Rails, and co-author with Kitty Dukakis of Shock. Previously, he was an award-winning reporter and national writer at the Boston Globe and a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. He now runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship. And tonight he'll be discussing his newest book, Demagogue, which focuses on the brief yet catastrophic reign of Senator Joseph McCarthy. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming AJ and Larry.
Hi, everybody. I'm up. I can hear the applause. I'm going to start with a magic trick, believe it or not. Larry's already nervous. He's starting with a magic trick. What I'm going to do is talk for a little while about politics to a whole bunch of strangers and not anger anyone. We'll see if it works. So I wrote this book, Dewey Defeats Truman. It's about the 1948 election. And two things happened while I was writing it. One thing is I found some very unexpected material during my research. And another thing is certain things happen in our world that sort of conspired to bring those two things together in a way that made it feel like the book I was writing was actually taking place in the time that I was living. It feels like it's taking place now. And I'm going to give you some examples. Here's an example. Let's see. One sentence from the most surprising document I found while researching the Dewey papers at the University of Rochester. So the United States of America is fair game for Moscow and has been for years. And as far as anyone is willing to see, the year 1948 will be the year in which Soviet Russia will do everything in its power to influence the election here. Well, that sounds familiar. Let me show you some photographs. Hopefully this works. So 1948 was the first election to be televised. This is actually election night broadcast on CBS. So television was a new media, changing the way campaigns ran and candidates thought about how to deliver their message. Today, we have social media. So in 1948, there was a massive surge in white nationalism. Today, we have, here's Charlottesville. So in 1948, this is a picture of a man named Isaac Woodard. Now, there was a rash of violence against African Americans right after World War II. And this gentleman was discharged from the Army and still in his uniform 4 hours later, got in an altercation with a white police officer and was permanently blinded. And he became a cause celeb. So here you see him being led to a podium to speak by Joe Louis, the heavyweight fighter. Orson Welles was actually fired from his radio show for speaking out on behalf of Isaac Woodard. So in 48, you had Isaac Woodard. Today, you have George Floyd. So here we have Alger Hiss. Suddenly, during the 1948 election, the Red Scare breaks out. Everybody in Washington is talking about the Red Scare. Is there a communist conspiracy in Washington? What is a conspiracy? What is a fact? No one can agree. And suddenly now conspiracy theories seem to be reigning in Washington. So in 1948, the FBI was on the trail of a major presidential candidate regarding a possible Russian conspiracy. Was Henry Wallace a front for the Soviets? Sounds familiar. During the 1948 election, the Berlin airlift is going on. So this is not an apples to apples comparison, but suddenly we were on nose to nose with the Soviets on the brink of World War III, and the whole electorate becomes ensconced in fear and anxiety. And certainly fear and anxiety is something we are all feeling right now for a very different reason, namely the reason why we all can't be together right now. Now, here's one thing that doesn't feel so relevant today. Imagine during the early part of the 1948 election, there's literally nuclear bombs going off as we're testing larger and larger weapons in the Pacific. Now, this is Harry Truman. So this new book I wrote really intends to do two things. It's talking about all of the things that are happening during the 1948 election, but what's really doing is telling the story of how Truman won the greatest upset in American electioneering history. Now, when I started writing this book, I was very concerned that people would say, this has been written about so much. And my feeling was I read all that had been written, and the book that I wanted to write was really very different. I wanted to write a book where there were 4 candidates in 1948. And I thought, what an amazing way to capture the essence of the country at a critical moment in our history by really following all 4 of those candidates and having their election campaigns unfold in real time, weaving them together, all of them leading to this climactic moment, November 2nd, 1948. Now, there were 4 candidates, as I said. I want to introduce you to them. So here's Henry Wallace, a candidate of protest. To me, Wallace was really the sort of beginning of the anti-establishment that was to follow. He was the one candidate who really raised his hand and said, hey, this new Cold War is not the Soviets' fault. It's Harry Truman's fault. Harry Truman is the one who's leading us into World War III with the Soviets. I am the only one who can save us. And by the way, pictured above him is his VP candidate of the Progressive Party, Glenn Taylor of Idaho, who was famous for actually hand-making his own hair pieces and had previously been a country western singer, very colorful character. Okay, so Strom Thurmond. So during 1948, Truman is, of course, launching the modern civil rights era. He desegregates the military. He becomes the first president to address the NAACP. He's the first presidential candidate to go in and campaign in Harlem, the spiritual home of Black America. And he does this because he thinks it's the right thing to do. Not everybody agrees. So Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats form their own party and storm out of the Democratic National Convention in July 1948. They form their own party, and here's their convention. And they run on one issue, pretty much one issue alone. I'm going to read you one sentence from what Strom Thurmond is saying right here tonight. He's saying, I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that there's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, and into our homes, and into our churches. These uncalled for and these damnable proposals Truman has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights, I tell you, the American people had better wake up and oppose them. So Thurmond, believe it or not, runs a whole campaign based on one issue, white supremacy, and he wins 4 states. Thomas Dewey. This is an amazing scene. This is the only time where the 2 main candidates meet each other. They're dedicating Idlewild Airport, which is now JFK. And right in this moment, they shake hands. And Truman leans over and says to Dewey, Tom, when you get into the White House, fix the plumbing for Christ's sakes, will you? Literally what he says. Thomas Dewey was everybody believed would be the first Republican president in 16 years. And when people write about 1948, they spend a lot of time at the Truman Library, but not a lot of people spend a lot of time with the Dewey papers at the University of Rochester. And I really wanted to bring his character to life. I really wanted to write about the identity crisis that was plaguing the Republican Party coming out of World War II. And I will say, I think the most poignant moment for me in this book is on election night, Thomas Dewey sitting by himself behind a closed door with a yellow legal pad, listening to the radio and realizing what was happening, that he was about to lose the greatest, something he was never going to live down for the rest of his life. So ultimately, we're back at Harry. I'm almost done speaking and I'll turn it over to Larry. So Truman begins the campaign season in 1948 knowing that everybody thinks there's absolutely no way he can win. So he has to come up with a plan to break every rule in the book. And he comes up with this idea. He thinks, if I go into every hamlet, every town, every small city, if I go to all of the places where presidents and presidential candidates never go, and I expose some of the magic of the American presidency to these people, and I talk to them face to face, I can win them over. And so what he does is he sets up the secret research unit that's in Washington in these little tiny cubicles, and they do all this research, and they fly these note cards in airplanes, and the Truman train is coming through town. Somewhere they meet, he gets all these note cards so that when he pulls into some little town, he knows that a sausage factory has just been built there, or a war hero has just died, or somebody was just elected mayor. So he can engage these people and he talks to them, and he does, he wins them over. And in the process, he becomes more than a candidate, he becomes an American folk hero. And one of the things I love about the story is, as you read it, hopefully people will read the book, it's a very good chance that you'll find Truman coming through your town. He came through my town. And I can go to the Truman Library website today and actually listen to the speech that he gave in my town. And you probably can too. My last point. Today, Democrats love Truman. Republicans love Truman. You will hear Donald Trump quote Truman. You will hear Nancy Pelosi quote Truman. He seems to be a standard bearer today as a symbol of honor and decency and patriotism, courage, and a very good time in American history for many. And so why does everybody respect him so much? I think if this book attempts to answer any question, it's that. So thank you. Larry, I can turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
So great. I want to first say something about AJ's book, which is that I wrote, I don't know if you're familiar with the term blurb, but I wrote a blurb for his book, which meant that I read his book and I love this book. And I want to, whether or not you buy my book at the end of this evening, I hope you buy AJ's book. I want to just take a few minutes and tell you things about 3 different themes having to do with my book. And the first one is the question that everybody should ask when they look at a book like mine, which is, why the hell does the world, which already has 100 biographies of Joe McCarthy, need biography number 101? And unless an author can answer that question, you should never buy their book. And I wasn't sure what the answer to that question was going to be when I started my book. I knew there were troves of material that nobody had ever seen about him. And I was inspired to write the book by somebody I interviewed for my last book. I interviewed a woman who at one point was the most popular woman in America after her husband died, a woman named Ethel Kennedy. And Ethel Kennedy said that Joe McCarthy might have been a monster to much of America, but to Bobby and Ethel, he was just plain good fun. And I thought that didn't quite square with my notion of, the notion of Joe McCarthy being good fun seemed counterintuitive to me. So I went out, I convinced a great editor at AJ and my publishing house to buy this book. And then I had to justify what the heck was out there that really made us need this 101st book on Bobby Kennedy. What I knew was out there when I started that nobody had really looked at, but it was already public, were 9,000 pages of all the closed door hearings that Joe McCarthy had held. And it turns out that 2/3 of the hearings he held, he locked reporters and the public out of the room. It turns out when he did that, we saw Joe McCarthy unhinged. As bad as he was in public, any notion of fair play, any notion of his staying sober for an entire hearing went out the door. And these 9,000 pages were a lot but I also knew they weren't really enough. So I worked from the moment that I started this book, I worked to try to get access to the great holy grail for Joe McCarthy, which were all the personal and professional papers that his wife left shortly after he died to Marquette University, his alma mater. And I did everything I could think of. I visited his daughter's home. I enlisted people who were friends of the family to try to help me convince the family to release these papers. And I want to tell you that none of it worked. And that I told my publisher in one of the more painful conversations that it wasn't going to happen. I told my wife it wasn't going to happen. And exactly a week after I assured them both it wasn't going to happen, I got an email from the chief archivist at Marquette saying, by the way, I'm the only person around who's going to be more surprised than you that the daughter has decided to unlock the papers, and not just unlock them, but unlock them in a way that a selfish author dreams about, which is make them public until I stop looking at them and then lock them up again. So what that meant was either I was going to write about them fairly and authoritatively, or nobody was, because they're now back under lock and key. The last thing that I got access to, again, exactly a week or two after I had given up on getting access, one day my wife and I were out on Cape Cod for a very early morning walk. And we saw at the head of the driveway an enormous brown box. And she said, let's see what that is. And I said, let's go on a walk. The papers will still be there. And that turned out to be all of McCarthy's medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital. I had been begging for them forever. I was convinced that nobody was even listening to my begging, and then they showed up there. So the bottom line is I had 3 special archives that I had the first real look at. And whether or not I wrote a good book, I can't say. But if I didn't, shame on me, because I had this extraordinary trove of materials. I would like now to take you briefly to 2 points in Joe McCarthy's life that I'd like to talk about. And I want to see if I can figure out here how to make the shared screen work. And great. So this is the last of the points. How do I get to so for a minute, you're going to have to actually just imagine what Joe McCarthy looks like, and I'm going to figure out how to make that work. But I want to take you to the moment where McCarthy's crusade against communism began. And that was, I don't know how many of you are familiar with something called the Lincoln Day Dinner, but that is a Republican ritual. Everywhere in America, they use Abraham Lincoln's birthday as an excuse to have a big fundraising event. And if you're a prominent senator, you get invited to places like New York and Washington, Boston, or San Francisco. If you're Joe McCarthy, a backbench senator who looked like he'd be a one-term senator that would mean nothing, you get invited to where he got invited, which is Wheeling, as his staff called it, Wheeling, West by God, Virginia. And he shows up in Wheeling, West Virginia for this Lincoln Day dinner with a big briefcase containing 2 speeches. And he's not sure until the last second which speech he's going to give. One speech is a snoozer on national housing policy, which is something he actually knew something about. And had he given that speech tonight, I would never have written my book and nobody would have known who Joe McCarthy is. Instead, he pulled out of his briefcase the second speech, which was a barn burner of a speech on communism, not just communism, communists in our government. And he held up in his hand a sheaf of papers, and he said, I have in my hand a list of 205 spies at the State Department. And he understood brilliantly that he wasn't just going to say there are spies in the State Department. He was going to count the spies, and it was 205, and he was going to name them. And he said he had all the names. Now, I'm not sure what he had in his hand that night. All I can tell you is, based on all the papers I looked at in his archive and everything else we know about him, it sure as heck wasn't a list of communists in the State Department. Some people said as the number changed over the next couple days. It went from 205 to 57 and back to 205. And some people said this guy who loved hamburgers had stopped into a cafe in Wheeling, had used Heinz 57 sauce and loved the number 57, and that was where he got his number of communists. But whatever the number was and whatever was really in his hand, from that moment on, Joe McCarthy hit the front pages of every newspaper in America. He never looked back. He never got off the front pages for 4.5 years. And he became synonymous with not just red baiting, but with embellishing and lying in politics. I want to now, from my last moment, head forward to that picture that we had up there for a second. I'm not sure how to get back to that picture. So this is Joe McCarthy when he was in the Army. This is Joe McCarthy when he was with a famous character named Roy Cohn at his hearings. And this is Joe McCarthy in the last moment that I want to take you to. And this is when Joe McCarthy died in 1957. And the official coroner's report in every newspaper in America said that he died of acute hepatitis. And that was a wonderful story. And that was a great cover, a very diplomatic thing. Most people had no idea what acute hepatitis was, and it was a very safe thing to die from. His medical records tell a different story. And Joe McCarthy actually died of acute alcohol poisoning. He was a drunk. He was a drunk back in his early days, but when he was censured by the Senate, his drinking went up phenomenally, and in the end, it cost him his life. But I'm less concerned for our discussion in the death of McCarthy than in the fact that McCarthyism still hasn't died. And I think that when I was writing this book, I had trouble remembering on a day-to-day basis at times whether I was reading the story from 70 years ago on Joe McCarthy or whether I was reading the story as told in every day's newspaper about what was going on in America. Because I'm convinced that the current occupant of the White House, whatever you think of him, was borrowing Joe McCarthy's playbook almost to the letter. We can see it in the way that when a wrecking ball was aimed at Joe McCarthy aimed 2 wrecking balls back at his opponent. We can see it in the fact that when one of McCarthy's manufactured charges against a scapegoat of an enemy was exposed as hollow, the next day he would lob a fresh bombshell. And we can see it in the fact that when the news was bad, McCarthy blamed the newsmen and the newswomen. And this would be an interesting hypothetical. And everybody who's writing a book at all connected to Donald Trump today says, my book is about Donald Trump and the story about what's going on in America today. My book, in my case, you can decide is legitimate or not, but in my case, there was a flesh and blood through line. And as probably most of you know, Donald Trump's tutor from the early 1980s, when he was launching his career as a real estate tycoon, was Joe McCarthy's protege from the 1950s. That was a young, brilliant, arrogant, eventually, I think, kind of evil lawyer named Roy Cohn. And Donald Trump says perpetually, has said perpetually over the last 4 years, when anything goes wrong, I wish I had Roy Cohn at my side or covering my back. And I think he does have Roy Cohn. And more importantly, he has his mentor's mentor, Joe McCarthy, spelling exactly how he is behaving in so many things that he does every day. What I would like to do is actually end my remarks there. And what AJ and I are going to do is go into if I can figure out here how to get back to the big screen, we're going to ask one another some questions about our books. And if you would let me, I'd like to start out by asking you a question. And that's not any of the questions that you were expecting me to ask. It's actually a question that I'm intrigued by who would have been the better president, who you think between Truman and Dewey. And I'm intrigued about that partly for a self-interested reason, which is Harry Truman did a really lousy job of standing up to Joe McCarthy. He tried and he failed to take down McCarthy. Dewey, on the other hand, was whispering in the ear of Dwight Eisenhower from the earliest days of his campaign all the way through his presidency. You've got to have the courage. You've got to stand up to this bully, Joe McCarthy. And while Eisenhower never listened, I was always impressed that Dewey did that. Does this suggest that Dewey could have been a good president and been effective in ways that Truman wasn't? Or was Truman the better guy to win?
It's a fascinating question. And first of all, let me just answer by saying, after November 2nd, 1948, all sorts of people came out of the woodwork playing Monday morning quarterback saying, this is terrible. Dewey would have been the good president. Richard Nixon later said in his memoirs that Harold Stassen should have been the candidate. And a number of people came out, it should have been it should have been Taft. And, but to answer, here's a couple of different ways to answer your question. I think Dewey would have been a fantastic president. He would have been a great two-term president. And for a number of reasons. One is he sort of came up in the Republican Party at a time that there was very much an identity crisis in the party. So the coalition on Capitol Hill was very conservative. These were the Republicans who grew up in the 20s. Dewey's hero was Teddy Roosevelt, which was a very progressive form of Republicanism. So when Truman and Dewey are on the campaign trail, they actually agreed on almost everything. And I think that's something people don't realize. That's why Truman, during the 1948 election, ran not against Dewey, but against the conservative 80th Congress, the do-nothing Congress. So it's interesting to think, had Dewey actually won, what would have been different? We don't know. But one thing I can say is Truman was a very courageous man. I don't think he was afraid of much. He was also a very good politician, which wasn't always the tool that he needed to be effective, turns out. With regard to McCarthy, Thomas Dewey came up a prosecutor. He was a vicious man. He was an attack dog. And I think that he would have put those prosecuting skills to work because he was brilliant. He knew how to be well prepared. He knew how to argue. He knew how to win. And I think he would have been very effective against McCarthy.
Interesting. Great.
My turn?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, Larry, let me say, I wish that I had the opportunity to read a blurb for your book because I thought it was so terrific. To me, reading it was like, you're cringing when you read this book, but you can't put it down because it's so fascinating. It's like watching a car speeding with no brakes toward a wall because you know how it's going to end, but you can't stop watching because the car itself and the person driving it is so interesting. Now, my question
Instead of asking
to you,
a question, why don't you just keep on? I love this. I'm kidding. That's the, thank you.
that's my question. What do you think? What was it like to spend 3 years with such a dark individual? And another way to ask that question is, from my point of view, I'm always fascinated. Almost all books are written by authors who have some level of respect and regard, and sometimes too much respect for the person that they're writing about. And my favorite novel of all time is Miss Lonely Hearts by Nathaniel West. And it's a short novel in which the writer just skewers his main character page after page. He loathes his main character, and it's hilarious. Your book is obviously not a comedy, but it's hard to write sometimes about someone who you don't have a terrific amount of regard or some level of regard. How hard was it to spend 3 years swimming in this guy's head?
Hard. It may have been the penance that I had to pay for writing 2 books on people I adored, who were Bobby Kennedy and Satchel Paige. On the other hand, no harder than reading every day's headline. And it helped me make it through 3.5 years of a presidency that was at times very painful to watch. And I think that Joe McCarthy had a side to him that also was charming. There was a reason why Wisconsin overwhelmingly elected him twice. There was a reason why in 1954, at the start of the Army McCarthy hearings, McCarthy was the second most popular politician in America, trailing only the incredibly popular Dwight Eisenhower. Fully 1 in 2 Americans thought that McCarthy was doing a great job. And I saw that charming side of McCarthy. It didn't in any way justify the dark side of him, but Joe McCarthy could rake somebody over his coals in his hearings for a day and have them be like a puddle at the end of that day and then invite them out that night for a drink, because to him it was all a game. And when people actually went out for a drink with him, they could be charmed by him. The thing that I think, though, more than anything helped me make it through the last 3 years of writing this book is that while it is a book about a dark character like Joe McCarthy, it has a happy ending. My book looks at demagogues throughout American history, the ones who preceded Joe McCarthy and the ones for whom he was the archetype, whether it was David Duke or George Wallace or anybody that you want to pick today. The happy ending is that throughout America's long history of having bullies and demagogues in charge, given enough rope, every one of them hung themselves. And the question is, can we afford to wait them out, and how long is it going to take to do that? But it encourages me that while Americans buy into these bullies, they also eventually realize that they've made a mistake and buy their way out. So my turn.
So it was in a sense therapeutic.
So it was in many ways. It was therapeutic in two ways. One was you can't help but, when you're writing about a guy like Joe McCarthy, do a little bit of armchair psychology and you figure out what the diagnosis was and what the therapy might have been. But the other was making it through this whole process and realizing there was a good ending with McCarthy, which is he started out 1954 at 50%. At the end of the Army McCarthy hearings, by that summer, he was down to 34%, and he was toast. I'd like to ask you, you talked about all the lessons for today. You showed your wonderful slides and you talked about how so many things in the setup back in the 1940s that you were looking at were mirrors of what we're going through today. Talk about what it says about where we're going to end up with this. What are the lessons, not just in seeing the similarities, but in telling us whether we can make it through, whether we've got to be worried about making it through?
Well, we've always made it through in the past. There's a number of different ways to answer that question. And to start with, one of the most interesting things I ever read in Harry Truman's voluminous memoirs was about how he wasn't a well-educated person. He had no college degree, but in fact, he was extremely educated in a different way in that he had spent his youth reading. He read and read. This is back before cell phones, back before this stuff, TV. And so he read. And he learned a tremendous about history, and he formulated this idea that history repeats itself. And so things that are happening now, you might see back in Mesopotamia, and that those lessons in history, which is why we should be reading books like this, can inform us about ideas we might use to get through current situations and reassure us that history comes in waves, and especially with a system that we hope is as wonderful as American democracy, that the ship will right itself. And the other way to look at it is, well, it's different today than it was in Truman's era. You can say, well, we just keep, it's like the planet is like a room and everybody can be friendly until you start cramming more people in there and turning up the heat, which is kind of like what's happening. So I'm very much an optimist, very nervously, that we're going to be doing fine and the ship will right itself, and that our political process and the documents that inform that will continue to move us in the right direction.
Great.
My turn for you?
Yeah.
Let me look and see what I've got here. Okay, I was fascinated by Joe's drinking. And one of the most fascinating, there's this moment in your book, right smack in the middle, where you're talking about the fact that he's drinking more and more. And he's having a glass full of whiskey with breakfast and a quarter stick of butter to right himself, as like, that was breakfast. And, he died, I think, at 48, right?
Correct.
And that's how old I am. And my question to you was like, was it painful to like go through the experience of seeing someone, whether you really, whether you respected or empathized with that individual at all, killing themselves with alcohol?
So it was really painful. And it was painful because I spent much of my life as a journalist, as a health reporter, and looking at issues of addiction and seeing Joe McCarthy have this addiction that he couldn't escape was really painful. It was also painful because when I went through those 9,000 pages of the transcripts of his closed door hearing, one of the patterns that emerged was in the morning of those hearings, Joe McCarthy seemed relatively balanced and sane. In the afternoon, when he returned from a lunch that generally consisted of a hamburger, a raw onion, and as many glasses of whiskey as he chose to have that day, his patience factor plummeted. And he would get angrier at witnesses. He had a short fuse. If the hearing dragged on until the evening, it was really bad. And I felt like I was watching the effects of alcohol, but I couldn't really say that for sure until I saw his medical records. And the doctors at Bethesda Naval Hospital couldn't do anything to help him lick his addiction, but they sure as heck were good at documenting it. And they documented over time the increase in consumption, and it got to the point that he was drinking a bottle a day. And watching that was painful. The last 2 days of his life, something happened that I'm convinced will never happen again with a public figure or anyone, which was they had by his bedside an orderly from the military who was keeping moment by moment records on every rant and rave that Joe McCarthy uttered, everything his nurses and doctors said, every test was ordered. And I think they did that because they were worried, and their worry actually proved true, that this ultimate master of conspiracies, that there would be a conspiracy about what killed him, that it might have been the Reds, it might have been whoever. So they were there documenting every moment of what went on. And any doubt of what he died of was erased by all that documentation and all those test results. And watching him go through the DTs and watching his fever spike to 107 degrees and watching him live those last painful days, no matter what you thought of Joe McCarthy, was tragic and painful in everything. And I think if you're okay with it, AJ, should we turn it back to Tom? I see that there's a good line of questions, and
I think that's a great idea.
Okay. Yeah, we do have a good amount of questions here. Some are for both of you and some are for one or the other. This is for you, AJ. This is from Ed from Iowa City, the home state of Henry Wallace. How disgruntled was Wallace at having been removed from the ticket in 1944, and how much of that contributed to his actions in 1948?
I think he was tremendously disgruntled. And the amazing thing is he wrote about it so much in his diary that when he wrote very specifically with dialogue and everything, what it was like to sit down with Truman after that. And the scenes are vivid. So let me explain just so that people understand. Henry Wallace was the vice president under FDR from 1940 to 1944, I think. Well, certainly, and he was pushed off the ticket in 1944 for this nobody, this obscure individual. And it was very, very wounding for him. And I think it had a lot to do with him wanting to get back at Truman. And I think the defining moment of like the one, his voice is like in my head, I can hear the sound of his voice. When he lost the election, he didn't just lose, he really didn't perform in the election as well as he'd hoped to with this, what he called Gideon's Army, this whole new political party that he had created to go after Truman. He refused to, I'm spacing the word, but when you've lost the election and you're supposed to write the, conciliation or whatever, concession. He refused to. What's it? Concession. He would refuse to concede, and he said, "I'm not giving that son of a bitch anything." Those were his last words in this book. Now, amazingly, Wallace had an about face. So by the time, a couple of years later, when Truman sent troops into Korea, Wallace supported him. And he even wrote that a lot of the ideas that he had during the 1948 election, he then disagreed with. So that's interesting too.
Okay. We actually have another question from Ed. This is for Larry. And he asks, what kind of media was present at the speech in Wheeling?
Great. So let's only take questions from Ed tonight. I think this is a good thing. The answer is almost no media. This was part of Joe McCarthy's brilliant way of playing the press. If you're going to give a speech, and he had a 50% chance of giving the barn-burning anti-communist speech that night, and you're going to make charges against specific people at the State Department against the White House. You want to give that speech in as out of the way place as you can. If you give the speech in Washington, where there is a sophisticated press corps, they're going to know just who to call on the phone and get a response from the State Department. If you give it in Wheeling, West Virginia, where the only reporters are a local AP reporter and a reporter for the Wheeling Intelligencer newspaper, nobody's going to call on anything. If you give the speech 5 minutes before their deadline, it's even more of a guarantee that any response from the other side is going to make page 24 tomorrow, whereas your speech is going to be on page 1 today. So very few reporters. The first day, the only story was in the Wheeling newspaper, and it took 2 days before it showed up in just about every page 1 across the country. And that was not accidental.
Here's another question for you, Larry, from Julianne. She asks, or she says, you make it sound like McCarthy was more of an influence on Cohn than vice versa. Is that correct?
So I think they each reinforced the worst instinct of the other. On the other hand, Joe McCarthy was twice Roy Cohn's age. He was his boss. And while a lot of people, with all the films coming out on Roy Cohn and a lot of understandable focus on who Roy Cohn became, a lot of people want to blame McCarthy's sins on Cohn. And I think that's letting him off too easily. But I want to say one more quick thing about that. Roy Cohn was John McCarthy's first choice for that job as chief counsel, which meant chief of staff. John McCarthy's second choice was a guy named Bobby Kennedy. And had Roy Cohn not taken the job and Bobby Kennedy been Joe McCarthy's chief aide, we can only dream about what different kind of a Joe McCarthy we might have seen.
Here is an interesting question for the both of you guys from Michelle. She asks, if you had Dewey, Truman, McCarthy, and Trump in a room, what does that scene look like, and what are they talking about?
You want to start?
That's a tough one. I mean, that's a play for Eugene O'Neill to write. Not necessarily something that we can accomplish tonight, but I don't know. I mean, I think they all like bourbon. Who knows what that would be? No, Donald Trump would, but that's a really tough question to answer. I honestly don't know what to say. I think that they would agree and disagree on a lot of things. I think that I don't think that Thomas Dewey or Truman would have much regard for anything that's happening now, and neither of them would have kept their mouths shut. And we saw how they dealt with McCarthy. So what do you think, Larry?
So I think it would have been a fist fight. When Joe McCarthy and Drew Pearson faced off in a supper club, they ended up getting into a fist fight. And McCarthy, as a former boxer, was winning the day until a famous Quaker named Richard Nixon stepped between the two of them. I think McCarthy loved to fight, and Donald Trump loves to fight. And I think Truman was a good farm guy from the Midwest, and I don't know enough about Dewey to say, but he was a hard-fighting prosecutor, and I think that whether or not the other two fought back, Trump and McCarthy would have pummeled them. And
the more I think about it, the more you're right. But I wouldn't count Truman out. He had his own. He had his own run-in with Drew Pearson. Drew Pearson wrote this story saying that Truman's daughter and wife had been on a train, and there were certain military soldiers that were not allowed on the train because there wasn't enough seats, and the military men should have been allowed. And the Truman mother and wife, first daughter should have gotten off the train and given their seats, and it was untrue. And so at the next press conference, Truman went up and he poked his finger into Pearson's gut, and he said, "You can call me anything you want, a thief, a liar, but if you ever say anything untrue about my wife or daughter, I will knock you out." So, you never know. It would be pretty interesting.
So when McCarthy beat up Drew Pearson, the next day somebody sent an engraved watch to McCarthy, basically congratulating him on that. And McCarthy always suspected that was Harry Truman.
Interesting. One other thing to add to this, Tom Dewey was very small, and the other figures not so much. He was known to have to stand on a dictionary when he spoke so he could make himself look bigger. So he was a great prosecutor, a great lawyer, but I don't know about fisticuffs.
Oh, here's another question for the both of you guys. Um, as you researched your subjects, did you see the nature versus nurture that formed them for better or worse?
I'll go first.
Sure.
I think absolutely, because otherwise it would be inexplicable for a farm guy who had never been the mayor of a city, never governor of the state, never, no college degree, never had the money to own his own home, to succeed the way he did, especially filling the shoes of Franklin Roosevelt, who came from the best schools, who had the best rearing. I think it has to be nature that this man, not only nature but fate, that he ended up in the White House to begin with. So there would be no logic that this person had been nurtured in a way that would have helped him succeed the way he did.
So I want to say with Joe McCarthy, I think it was more nature than nurture. His brothers and sisters turned out to be low-key, non-aggressive, non-ambitious, and Joe McCarthy was not just his nature of being a ruthless character, but I think, and again, I don't want to be an armchair psychologist or psychiatrist. A lot of people have speculated over the years whether Joe McCarthy had something going on in terms of a form of narcissism that was never diagnosed. I think based on what I saw in his medical records and what I came up with sitting down with very smart doctors, psychiatrists, and other kinds of doctors, analyzing those records and other things about him, I think he was what they would have called then manic depressive and what today would be called bipolar. The depression, the states of depression were commented on by his doctors going back to his days in the Marine Corps during World War II. And the manic phases were there for anybody who was watching the Army McCarthy hearings or anything else he did on television to watch. And I think that maybe he was destined to a lot of the personality issues that he suffered because of that kind of nature. But I think that his parents, while they always stuck up for him, would not have wanted to claim the nurturing credit for who he became.
I have to say, reading the book, Larry, that occurred to me on numerous occasions that if that man were alive today, that he would have been diagnosed.
Here's one for Larry from Andrea. She asks, how do we apply the lessons that you learned from McCarthy to changing how politics works in the future?
So that, if my book has any underlying thesis, it is that on the one hand, we are subjected at moments that we think we're beyond that to new demagogues, or the first line of my book is, this is a book about America's love affair with bullies. And it really is. And I keep thinking that as we, on a micro level, become better at recognizing bullies in the classroom, we'll be better at recognizing bullies in the Senate or whatever other office. And so it is looking at the history of demagogues to try to come up with an answer to Andrea or Andrea's question. And I think there are answers. And I think that we can know our history better. We can recognize, as AJ and I are talking about tonight, that all the things we're seeing going on today are repetitions of things that have happened in the past. Donald Trump is Joe McCarthy redux. And if we understood the story of Joe McCarthy better, I think we might have recognized some of Donald Trump's failings earlier, or I at least hope so. AJ.
Oh, I mean, I have to agree. I think you said it right on the money. It's the fact that history repeats itself, of course. Yeah. So.
We have one for AJ. Truman is famous for his relationship with Herbert Hoover and reaching out to him during his presidency. Did he reach out to Dewey during his presidency, since he ran against the Congress, as he said, and not Dewey?
That's interesting. You know, Truman took some heat for reaching out to Hoover the way he did. There were members of his party thought that wasn't such a good idea. But in terms of Dewey, not so much. But I did find some really interesting documents in the Dewey papers where it was more that Dewey reached out to Truman. And two things strike me. One was when Truman sent troops into Korea. It was highly controversial, very upsetting for a lot of people. And Dewey wrote this heartfelt memo to him saying, hey, look, if I was in the White House, I would have done the same thing. And the other letter I remember finding from Dewey to Truman was that after Truman's assassination attempt in I think it was the 50 or 51, Dewey wrote another heartfelt letter saying, thank God nothing happened to you or to anybody in your family. But so I think they really formed a cordial relationship after that. And we also have to remember that Dewey was still the governor of New York and a very powerful man who wanted to be involved in national politics and eventually actually helped Eisenhower get the nomination and so forth. Yeah.
Here's one for Larry. This questioner asks, didn't McCarthy also become addicted to morphine? And also they're wondering if you did any FOIA requests to view the FBI files on McCarthy.
So the first thing any journalist or author does when they're starting all of this is sends out 1 million FOIAs to everybody in the world that you can think of. And yeah, I did. And FOIA is an incredibly valuable tool to have out there and incredibly useless to most journalists and authors by now, because agencies have figured out a way to get around FOIA in a dozen ways. The morphine part of the question, so there were, it was alluded to in a book by the former head of the DEA, whatever, I can't remember what the agency was called back then, that a prominent politician, and they may have even said prominent senator, had a morphine addiction. It was speculated in various columns that McCarthy had a morphine addiction. There was nothing in his medical records that gave even a whiff of that, other than the fact that he got high levels of narcotics the way many too many patients did when they were treated back then. That was the way you took them out of their pain. That was the way you stopped them from being a pain in the neck to you as a doctor. But his addiction to it, his close friends denied it. His doctors didn't say anything about it. And I can't believe, given all the damaging stuff there was in his records, if there had been an addiction to morphine, that wouldn't have shown up at some point.
Let me address one point there, Larry. I agree with it. It's interesting. The first thing you do when you decide to write about anybody is you send all the FOIA letters out. A lot of people might not know what that is, Freedom of Information Act. And every time I do this, I send those letters out. It does strike me, FOIA often gets criticized for not functioning properly. The journalists and writers aren't able to access the information that they should. And I also look at it the other way. It's incredible that the program exists in the first place, and does say a lot about our country, the fact that we do have some transparency in government here. And so if I want to see, FBI files on Henry Wallace, of course I can find them. And the Henry Wallace FBI files was full of interesting things. It was really fascinating to find out what the FBI thought of Henry Wallace in 1948. But I'm just thankful that our tax dollars pay for that.
So can I just say one more quick thing in terms of process that AJ and I and everybody who writes these kind of books goes through? So people talk about sending out FOIA requests. People talk about all kinds of things that you should do when you're writing a book and trying to get information. Anybody who has watched me tonight knows that I did not get access to the papers that I got because I'm charming. I got access because as a journalist, you learn to be persistent. And the fact that somebody's turned you down 15 times doesn't mean you don't ask the 16th time. And I think the only thing that separated me from all the people that McCarthy's family said no to was that I was enough of a pain in the neck that they realized at some point that the only way to get rid of me was to say yes. And I think that AJ would, I'm sure, say the same thing, the persistence, which is not sexy, but it's the only thing that ends up working.
So we have a couple people that are asking about what you guys are working on next, and if you have any projects lined up.
We both do. AJ, what's your next book?
Well, I think it's just interesting that Larry and I are with the same publisher, with the same editor, and came out with 2 books on the same day. And I think I saw on your website that you're working on a book about Duke Ellington and the jazz scene in the 1920s. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so I'll talk about, you got it right, and I'll talk about that in a second, sure.
Okay, so, but it's just interesting that once again, our subjects are sort of dissecting again, because I'm writing a book about a very little known civil rights leader who moves to New York in 1918. He's identifies as African American, but is in fact his skin is as white as any white person, and he becomes a racial crusader, going into the South, pretending to be a white man and investigating murders of Black people in 1918 during the Red Summer of 1919. The Marion lynching in 1930, the Aiken lynching in 1926. And so that's it. But it's also a story that takes place quite a bit during the Harlem Renaissance. And he becomes this fabulous figure of the Harlem Renaissance at the same time living a double life as a white person and a Black person. So I'm studying probably some of the same documents that you are looking at, Larry.
Can you say who that is?
His name is Walter Francis White.
The famous, oh, I love it. So one more reason we have to talk after this. So I wrote a book a while ago about some guys who worked on the railroads, some ex-slaves who rode on the railroads called Pullman porters, and Walter White came up a lot in that book. And the Pullman porters who I wrote about, these were extraordinary men who I argued in my book were the basis of today's African-American middle class. A disproportionate number of these men's children or grandchildren, nieces or nephews, turned out to be influential Americans, including the great-grandfather of Michelle Obama. But I made the Pullman porters two promises when I got done interviewing them. One was that I would someday write about one of their favorite characters that they carried on the trains, a guy named Satchel Paige, a Negro League ball player. And the other was that someday I would write a book about their three favorite passengers, who were Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie. And I'm writing a book, the tentative title for which is The Jazzmen, Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America, which I'm convinced that they did. But I want to say just one last thing about that book. If you've spent 3 years with Joe McCarthy, your publisher owes it to you and you owe it to yourself to get to spend 3 years with people like Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And I am having a blast. My last interviews were with Wynton Marsalis and John Batiste. I'm interviewing ancient jazz guys where I feel like I'm in a race against the obit pages to get to these people. And every one of them, I wish that I could spend days interviewing.
So I think we have time for one more question. And I'm going to go to this one from Michelle Baime. And she asks, in modern partisan politics today, do you believe that there is a unifying Truman-esque politician out there that can someday unify the country with their ideas and style to allow families and friends who support different parties to be able to come together and talk about politics, or anything for that matter, again? So many broken relationships these days. What and who will it take to get this healing process for our country so we can start getting things done?
Let me start with that because I know Mrs. Baime. Thank you for the question, Mrs. Baime. This is something we talk about with our children quite a bit. And, the answer is the system has righted itself in the past because the democratic process has worked. Now, who the person is that's going to rise up and be that person to help us get there, because our country needs leadership, whether you agree with what's going on in the White House or not. Well, we just don't know who that person is. And we were just talking yesterday. I want to know who the people are who are really rising up in the new generation, the 18-year-olds, the 19-year-olds, who are rising to the mantle of leadership, because I think that's extremely important. Those are the people who are going to get the new generation really involved in the political process. Because if we've learned from the past, when not enough Americans are involved in the political process, that's when we find demagogues.
So that question was definitely directed to AJ, and he's much smarter than me, but I want to just say one quick thing about who I think that person's going to be, and it's a self-serving thing to say, but I think that person is going to be whoever the next Bobby Kennedy is, because I think that Bobby Kennedy was running for office in 1968 at exactly this kind of moment, a moment of racial division, a moment when we needed somebody who could not just appeal to their natural base, but appealed to angry Donald Trump voters. And I think Bobby Kennedy, who started out as a protege of Joe McCarthy, went through a political transformation where his initial base was an ethnic white conservative voter, and he would have been the perfect one to unite the Joe Biden camp with the Donald Trump camp and be a healing figure. And I can say that because we don't know, because Bobby Kennedy tragically died too young to know whether he could really do that kind of healing. Can I also say, I presume, are we going to wrap at this point? Because I would like to say one self-serving thing in wrapping up. And that is, I won't tell you that you ought to go out and buy my book, although I would tell you that if you do, you should buy it from Politics and Prose and nowhere else. You should definitely go out and buy AJ's book. But I think I can make an offer for him as well as for me, if it would be an incentive at all to do that and to do it from this wonderful bookseller who has sponsored tonight's event. AJ and I would, through the bookseller, be glad to personalize a signature plate and send it to you. We wish we were there with you live and be able to sign the book, but the next best thing is to send you a sticker that they will put in the book for you.
Thank you for bringing that up. And if you are interested in that, please email events@politics-prose.com. Again, that's events@politics-prose.com. And gentlemen, thank you for a fascinating discussion. This was really great. And this is a really interesting look at an interesting time in our history. Just to remind everyone again that to purchase the books, there are 2 links in the chat. And thank you all for joining us tonight on Politics and Prose Live, and we will see you next time.
Thank you,
AJ.
much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, everybody who attended. So much appreciated.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.